So welcome back, everybody. This is Night Flight. I'm Judith Quoba, and I'm here with Jerry Marzinsky tonight. Finally, we made it. Jerry Marzinsky has been working in the healthcare industry and especially as a mental counselor for over 30 years in the prison system, in huge hospitals, and I'm very happy that he is here. He will be answering your questions that you have left. So Jerry, welcome to Night Flight.
Okay, I'm glad to be back. And thank you for sending these questions. Some of them are very good questions. And I was surprised. I mean, and I found that some of them were the same questions I was asking myself when I was working with these guys. You know, it's like, well, that's the same question I asked myself, you know, and I had to go after the answer with it. So I guess we're just going to kind of work down the list here.
Yeah, okay. And, before we do that, you have published the book with Sherry, yeah?
Oh yeah, it just came out, and I think I sent you the ordering link. But
yeah, I will put that in the description box.
Yeah, it was actually amazing how what we had was a draft copy. And we had that at the publishers, and it wasn't supposed to be out for dissemination. But somehow 4 people found out who the publisher was, and I'm not quite sure how they did that. And one of them was from France and ordered a draft copy, which was a mess. And Sherry wrote her and said, well, that wasn't supposed to go out. We're going to send you the finished copy when we're done with it. And even though it was a mess, she was a graphic designer. And she said, this information was so useful to me that I'm offering to do your cover for you for free. And Sherry and I are like blown away. We're like, oh, yeah, sure. So this is what we came up with here.
The amazing journey into the psychotic mind, breaking the spell of the ivory tower. Fantastic. I like the cover.
Yeah, it came out a lot better than the original one we had, and you know, it's a slam against psychiatry and the academic people who were trying to treat everything with toxic drugs, and they've been trying to do that forever, and they can't conceive of an illness that has no physical cause or physical cure. It's just outside of their belief system. They just can't grasp it. But shamans have been curing schizophrenia for hundreds of thousands of years. And the stuff that Van Dusen and Sherry and I have found, the ways to work with this stuff where it completely gets rid of the psychotic voices, and once they're gone, the schizophrenia is gone.
Yeah, sure.
And so all that's contained in here, and we're hoping it helps a lot of people who don't understand, and maybe wakes up some people in the mental health system that are on the verge. They can sense that these voices are not hallucinations, but they have no other explanation other than this false, contrived chemical imbalance theory that they're just made up. And has no backing whatsoever. Matter of fact, it's been disproved.
I just saw a couple of minutes ago, there is a German channel, and the entire speech is in German, so it will not be useful to you, but he is a doctor as well, and he talks about healing mental illnesses without drugs. So it's catching on.
Well, that's good. Now, that doesn't mean the drugs aren't useful, because some of these cases, the voices are so strong that if you try to say anything against them, they just flare up and blot out anything you have to say. So what should happen, it should be a combination of the drugs to weaken the voices, but not to the point where they're gone, because you have to have some ground, you know, to see what kind of progress you're making. So you can lower the drugs while you're using the techniques in this book. And then when you hit a point to where you've lowered them and you can no longer hear them, as long as you stay on that path, you know, you're good. So it all boils down to frequency. So you don't have to be a Christian or a Muslim or that's one of the things I spoke to an exorcist who called me in Phoenix, and he's curing Christians like that. I said, well, what about Muslims? What about people who don't believe in God? Well, sorry, I can't do anything for those guys. But this stuff will. Now, the catch is once you clear them out, it takes effort to keep them.
Okay.
And you need to increase your frequency and stay on a positive spiritual trajectory to keep them out. Because if you keep doing the same things they've always done, they're going to come back. So it does take effort. I mean, and nobody can do it. They have to do it. So we can give them the tools and say, if you do these things, you will get results. And Sherry has a whole section of people who've done these things, and the voices either greatly diminished or disappeared. So what do they call those, witnesses? Or she's got a section on her webpage for people who've done that.
Okay.
But yeah, there is a cure.
Yeah. So shall we start with our first question?
Okay. The first question is, how do you distinguish between predators and disassociated alters? Is this something you've encountered, considered, or was it completely discounted in your professional experience? I am retired and had a similar career background for a number of years. I'd like to say that I have little faith in psychiatry. I work with many people who, due to childhood trauma, had fragmented personalities and who were frequently misdiagnosed as schizophrenic. The understanding of disassociation was almost non-existent then and was certainly dismissed when suggested to both psychiatrists and psychologists. Well, that sounds like their MO. They have their ideas of what is and what should be, and they're not open to anybody who comes at them from outside those parameters. Most schizophrenics have had horrible trauma, sexual, physical abuse, and they have kind of disassociated to some degree.
But not to the degree that they have developed alters?
Well,
or would you call the voices in the head alters?
Well, the voices in the head are not who they are, but they don't. The person listening to those voices, for the most part, doesn't understand that. So these entities enter the person's mind through a negative thought that they believe is their own. Right? And if they, you look at psychiatry and psychology now, they'll call schizophrenia a split mind. Okay, so they call it that, but they don't react to it as if it is. They just drug the brain. So one of the main things that has to happen here is the patients have to realize that those thoughts, and basically for all of us, any negative thought about yourself or anybody else is coming from these guys. And if you believe that it's your thought and you buy into that, you're in trouble. And they have to understand that not all their thoughts are their own. And that's something that is not even dealt with by psychiatrists and psychologists. When I was in the PhD psych program, I asked the head of the department one day in a lecture, where do thoughts come from? And he looked like a Martian who'd just fallen at his feet. He just stood up there like, it's clear he'd never thought about it. And he goes, well, I'll talk to you after the lecture. And then he virtually ran out of the room. So right now, people believe that every thought that they think belongs to them. But if you sit back and just observe your thoughts as they appear in your head, and you're sitting there and you're watching, okay, here's one, there's one, there's one. You have to ask yourself, well, who's the watcher? You can't be the thought and watcher at the same time. And all of us have voices in our head. and they're always talking to us, and most of it is garbage. And when you're done thinking those thoughts, you're the same person you always were, and that voice goes out and it seeks evidence in the environment to substantiate what it's telling you. And so each of us have a story, and you have to ask yourself, well, okay, who's listening? Who's listening to that garbage? And if you pay attention to your thoughts, you'll see that like 80% of them, 85% of them is just garbage, worried about the future, worried about the past. And then you wonder, okay, where did they come from? And you can ask yourself, okay, what's the next thought I'm going to have? And you don't know what it is. Now, if you're doing a number series or something like that, you go, well, okay, if I'm repeating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I know the next one's going to be 6, but we're talking about thoughts. So they don't appear from a level that is conscious. Mm-hmm. And if you say, okay, what's my next thought? You're going to draw a blank because it's not there yet. They arrive from the subconscious mind, and research has shown that there's a reaction before the conscious mind even is aware of the answer. So they can pick that up physiologically. So when you talk about disassociated alters,
it sounds a little bit like MK Ultra, yeah?
Well, yeah.
Term.
The term, and what happens is that these people are so traumatized that these entities are searching for negative emotional energy, and they're drawn to that like sharks are to blood. So what happens is that when that damage is triggered, there's a negative emotional explosion, and that's what they feed off of, and it's called loosh by other terms, I think.
So in other words, could we say that MK Ultra, we know the process via torture, via sexual abuse, alters are created, and with the schizophrenic, it's entities attacking them, making them believe negative thoughts, and then attaching them, and that's the difference.
Yeah, that would be basically the difference. Now the entities, their goal is to have the patient generate as much negative emotional energy as possible. And it doesn't matter how they do that, and they do it mostly with lies. So the body reacts to a negative situation that's imaginary just as bad as it does to one that's actually happened. I mean, it doesn't know the difference. If the voices can create a situation that looks and appears to be real to the person, like, okay, this guy's going to kill you, or they're following you around, or people are talking behind your back, they don't care. What they're after is that negative emotional response, and then they drain that. So schizophrenics, they'll all tell you that after the voice is attacked, they're completely drained. People who are very depressed, they'll tell you they're completely drained. And these entities have complete access to your entire memory, so they can go in there, and Carlos Castaneda brought this up. He said they virtually give you their mind, and you're not aware of it. So they can go in there, and I've had patients tell me that the voices brought up stuff that they had forgotten decades ago. They hadn't remembered in 20, 30 years something, and these things brought it up and started rubbing it in their face. Remember when you did this horrible thing? So they kind of do that to all of us to different degrees, but it's most pronounced with schizophrenics, where they're actually talking to these things. And a lot of the times, if you listen to them, they're actually arguing with their voices. They don't want to do what the voices are telling them to do. Van Dusen talked about one lady who was leaving the gate of the hospital, walking off the hospital grounds. This was a state hospital in California, arguing with her voices that she didn't want to do that. And you know, anybody who's worked with on a psych hospital will hear these guys conversing with their voices. It's like a one-sided telephone conversation, and it's coherent. It's not like word salad. It's not like they're just saying words randomly. I mean, they're talking in complete sentences. It's like somebody, you know, you're listening in on a telephone conversation or an argument that somebody's having with their boyfriend or girlfriend. So, yeah, to one degree, the MK Ultra guys are doing the same things that hypnotists do, where they hypnotize an audience and say something to the effect of, you know, when I say the word sugar or something, you're going to get up and quack like a duck. And he says the word sugar, and one of the people that he's hypnotized in the audience gets up and starts quacking like a duck and doesn't even know why they did that. So the voices kind of do the same thing, but they got a much more malicious intent. They want to turn your energy, the energy you've been given by the creative spirit, negative, and that's the only way they can consume it, is when it is negative. So if you look at the kind of things that the voices commonly tell schizophrenics, it's like, you're stupid, you're ugly, nobody loves you, you're crazy, people are talking behind your back. I mean, we got lists and lists of them on the website. They're all negative, and most of them are lies. But if the person believes that every thought that comes into the mind is theirs, belongs to them, and they created it, and in a lot of cases that's the way it is, because they don't understand where else a voice would come from, where else would thoughts come from. And that's not anything that psychology or psychiatry is asking at this point. They don't even ask the question, let alone research it. But when you start looking into, you know, they've just kind of blown off the voices as hallucinations, which is a huge disservice. And they've done this without any research whatsoever, none, zero. They haven't done any research into what these voices say, how they behave, any patterns they do. They just arrogantly dismiss them as hallucinations with no evidence to back that. It's just like, okay, we've got a medical degree, we've got a PhD, and we're saying this, and that's the way it is, without any research or backing or anything. You ask these guys, what patterns do these things run? They don't know. But they run a consistently negative pattern. I mean, if they tell you anything positive, it's for a negative purpose down the road, like drug addicts. I don't know how many meth addicts I've had tell me that the voices told them when they run out of amphetamine, they would tell them where to be and when to be there to get more. And they would show up and somebody would just appear out of nowhere and have this stuff. You know? So these things, not all of them, but in a lot of cases, they know stuff that the patient himself would not know. And when that happens, it's like, oh man, these things are powerful. These are supernatural. I want the drug, and they know where to get it, and they're helping me. You know? But the end result is this person's going to end up in prison, or he's going to end up hurting himself or somebody else in the end run. So yeah, once the voices start taking over, there's a disassociation between what the voices are telling the person they are and what they're thinking, what that person was before the voices came. So we were talking about earlier that one that came into the ER, the father brought the son in because when he called him by his proper name, the guy would go ballistic and say, that's not who I am. Your son is dead. I'm no longer your son. You know, I am, you know, Joe Blow. I'm not your son. He's dead. And the voices had completely taken him over.
So we have the next question, and that is, at what point is it safe to stop taking toxic drugs?
That's an interesting question, because the psychiatrists and psychologists will tell you it's never safe to stop taking these toxic drugs because they don't know of any other way to deal with this. They were told in medical school or in psych programs that the only way to deal with schizophrenia is through these drugs, which are toxic. And if they keep taking them, it's going to destroy their brain cells, it's going to destroy their peripheral nervous system, and there's a whole list of all kinds of nasty side effects: dry mouth, sexual dysfunction, nausea, kind of dizziness. It goes on for like a page, all these horrible side effects. But what they do is they will weaken the voices. They will, in most cases, they won't get rid of them completely, even on higher doses. So with their scenario, this is like a catch-22. You either take the medicines and you suffer the toxic effects, or you go insane. But if you use the practices that we've kind of published on Sherry's website and in this book, and you use them consistently with the medications, you'll be able to lower the medication. So if they stick with what we're telling them to do, the voices will get weaker and weaker. And one of those things is the That's a Lie program. So what these things, they have to, before they can even put that stuff to use, they have to understand that the voices are not who they are. These are psychic invaders, and that they are parasites. And they will see for themselves that after they attack and leave, their energy level is drained. But they won't understand that the voices did that. They were the ones who drained them. Now, I don't know how they do that, but it's consistent. There's almost a 100% probability that after these things attack, these guys are going to be drained. And we did measurements on this, and it proved to be statistically significant. But you ask the patient, well, where'd your energy go? And they will say, well, I don't know. And you give them a similar thing, say, okay, if you stuck your hand in the fire 100 times and each time you were burned, what burned you? They have no trouble saying it was a fire. But if you say, okay, the voices have come thousands of times over the last few years you've been dealing with these things, and each time that the voices have come, your energy levels drop to zero. What do you think is responsible for your energy disappearing? They'll say, I don't know. They can't get it. They're being blocked. And I found that very odd that would happen. So what happens is that when you start working with these schizophrenics and they're on drugs, there's three categories they break up into. The most successful ones, the ones that are the least disturbed, are the ones that know that the voices are not who they are. They may not know what they are or where they come from, but they know that they're not who they are or who they know themselves to be. So they have a split there between who they are and what the voices are, which makes a huge difference, because once you realize they're not you, then the concept of that your mind is attacking itself and it's out of control is there's a huge difference between those two. If you realize you have an enemy and that enemy is outside of you, then you can start looking for ways to deal with that. But if the enemy is you, if you think it's your brain and you believe what psychiatry is saying, that you're nuts, you're crazy, it's a chemical imbalance in your brain, there's nothing you can do about it except take these toxic drugs, that's a very debilitating and hopeless situation. And the voices are, the drugs are toxic, they're poisonous. So there's three categories. There's the one who realizes the voices aren't who they are. Those guys are ready to start using the stuff that we talked about in the book. There's the ones who aren't sure. If you can convince them that the voices aren't who they are, then they can put that information to use. Mm-hmm. Then there's the last group who believes what psychiatry and psychology are saying is that, yeah, you're crazy, you're nuts, it's a chemical imbalance in your brain, and they have no idea what the chemical balance of the brain should be. None, zero. You know, they don't know what's out of balance, out of the scores of chemical transmitters in the brain. They have no way to measure anything about what is out of balance or by how much. Yet where that imbalance thing came from, for back in the 70s when Eli Lilly came out with Prozac, they went, oh, it's a chemical imbalance. And Eli Lilly knew at the time that that was a lie. You know, they knew they had no evidence for this. All they had was a correlation, but they let it fly anyway to market their Prozac. And here's people going nuts on Prozac and killing people after taking their Prozac. You know, but when this stuff was first discovered, they had no idea why it worked. And you know, it does work. I mean, it was a wonder drug when it first came out, because they had no way to control these massive psychotic populations that were filling the mental health centers. They would use straitjackets, and that required a fight. You know, they weren't going to get into a straitjacket on their own. And when I was working at the state hospital, some of the old-time attendants would talk about horrendous fights they had with psychotic patients, trying to get them into a straitjacket because they had no other way to control them. So the ones who are the worst off are the ones who believe what psychiatry and psychology are telling them, that their brain is broken.
Okay, so in other words, if you have really no idea what's really going on with you, then it makes no sense stopping the drugs. If you have a slight idea that the voice is not you, or you are starting to doubt that, that might lead you to the road where you can reduce them. And the ones that comprehend, hey, something else is going on, these voices that has nothing to do with me, then they can slowly but gradually lessen.
Right. If they use the stuff that we put on Sherry's website and in the book, and specifically what we call the That's a Lie program, because these entities will tell them all kinds of malicious lies. And try to get them to buy into it. What they're like is, since they have access to your memory, they know all the places that you've been damaged and traumatized, and they will pick at those places, you know, and say things that will inflame that psychological damage, which generates negative emotional energy. So they're like fishermen. They're like, you know, okay, I know there's a fish in this pond somewhere, and they're probably under the bridge there, so I'm going to throw this in and see if I get a bite. And if you bite on it, and it generates that negative emotional reaction that they're looking for, then they start picking at it. So if you don't know what's going on, it's like, you know, you can't control that process. You think it's you, and you know, well, what's going on with me? I don't understand. There's no concept that these thoughts are not your own, that they're picking at a damaged area. But what they do is they do point out what areas of damage there is. So if you trace it back, and every time somebody comes, and what'll happen is the universe will take care of drawing to you the people who will bring these damaged areas up, and the voices will do that too. So every time you see something in somebody else that upsets you, you've got it in you, or you wouldn't see it. So when somebody comes and pisses you off, that's something in you that you recognize in them. And there's kind of like an inverse scale. If you've got a little bit of that bad trait in you, it takes somebody with a whole lot of it to really piss you off. On the other hand, you got these real volatile guys that, you know, they've got a whole lot of it, and it just takes a little bit to piss them off. And I think we all know people like that, where you got to kind of tiptoe around them, because if you say something wrong, they go off.
Yeah.
So this could be useful if you realize that that's what they're doing, and that they're showing you areas within your psyche that need to be healed. You know, but if you don't understand that, they're going to tear you to pieces.
Okay, so moving on. Do auric holds caused by trauma, abuse allow these entities to take hold?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert on auric holds, but yes, they feed
But
off the trauma.
we can rest assured that trauma and abuse is will not leave the aura untouched.
Well, yeah, trauma. Most of the patients and prisoners I've dealt with have been horribly traumatized in one way or another, physically, sexually, emotionally, and they started hearing these voices telling them you deserved it. Sherry talked about that in some of her interviews, where the voices would come and like, you asked for it, you deserved it, you're getting just what you want, you like this. And the shamans are talking about these entities that embed themselves in the auric field and interfere with people. So I've heard a number of them talk about that. And I remember when I was working with, it got pretty intense in the emergency room, but after a while I could feel the presence of these things when they were attacking. And it was like this icky, cold electrical feeling. And it corresponded to how strong the voices were. And what would set that off, I think there was another question later on that dealt with this, what would set that off is when I went to tell the patient that these things, and I would only do that with the ones I felt could comprehend what I was saying, because otherwise it would just set off a reaction and it wouldn't do them any good. But in the ER, the purpose was not to help the patient. It was to get them out of the ER as quick as possible and make a determination, can we release this guy? Does he have to stay here for a while? Or do we have to admit him? Or can we send him to a mental health center? But bottom line, the medical doctors wanted them out of their ERs because they didn't know what to do with these guys. They didn't understand them. They didn't understand how to treat them other than just drug them senseless. I could feel these things collapse. I felt like, like on Star Trek, they had the shield, around the ship, and it would, after it took a lot of battering, it would start shrinking. I could feel the same thing on some of the psychotics that came into the ER that were very, they were eaten up with strong voices, but they also understood that those voices weren't who they were. Now, if the idea can be gotten across to them that these things aren't just tormenting them, but are actually feeding off them, that makes a huge difference. It's like, okay, you have a tapeworm in your intestine and it's innocuous. It's just sitting there. It's, it's not causing any damage. It's just there. Versus, well, you got a tapeworm in your intestines. It's sucking you dry, man, and it's making you sick. You're going to try to do something about that. You're going to react a lot more strongly than if it's innocuous. So, yeah, with prisoners, especially psychotic prisoners, I did not want to read their record ahead of time unless I had to, because it would bias, my thinking as to who that person was. Instead of dealing with the person in front of me, I was now stuck with the history. And the only reason I would dig into their record if I had to, and the times I did that, I would find horrendous abuse. They were locked in closets. They were burned. They were made to kneel on corn. They were beaten, burned, abandoned. It was just horrific. So they were programmed that way, and then they throw these guys in prison and they make them even worse, and then they release them on society after they're done being brutalized in prison. So they come out of there not only psychotic, they give them 2 weeks worth of drugs and say, when you run out, go to the nearest ER. The ER isn't going to give them any meds other than calm them down, and then they release them back out in the community again, and they end up in the mental health center going round and round and round. And a lot of them don't. They end up on the streets or they end up in prison. So the prisons are now the state hospitals at a cost that's horrendously more than keeping these guys in a state hospital, because now they got to pay for the security. The treatment they get is well below community standards in most cases. And when I worked in the psych department of the prison, it was like, okay, if these psychotic guys aren't causing any major problems, we're not going to give them any medications because it costs too much. So, yeah, the trauma and abuse has to be dealt with.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
that is why I always say, clear out your trauma.
Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The less clutter you have there, the less they can attack you.
Right, and people have to understand that every thought has a charge. Every word has a charge. It has an emotional charge. So if they were abused, they're very sensitive to that. So anything that looks like it may be abuse is going to be interpreted as abuse, and it's going to be reacted to as abuse, even though the person who might have said something had no intention of it being so. So if they don't deal with the trauma, that just keeps rolling on and on and on. And the way they were programmed was to look for that abuse and watch for these kind of people who do that. Anything that looks similar is going to set them off. And then the other person's going to go, whoa, where'd that come from? You know, I didn't mean that. I didn't say that. And they go, well, this guy's touchy. I'm not sure I want to deal with him. He just goes off at like a flashbulb. You think that gets to that one, or?
Yes. So, do you see any connection between general artificial intelligence and the source of the voices, considering the hive mind-like attribute of the voices?
Now that's a very interesting question. So, from my experience, what I saw was that the voices in the patients I dealt with at Central State Hospital, 2,500 miles away from where I am now, were saying the same things to the patients I dealt with in Iowa and the patients I dealt with in the ERs and in the prisons. It's like the same agenda. It's this list of horrible things that they say to people. You know, you're no good, you're rotten, you're stupid. That kind of stuff. I mean, it's all kind of standard stuff that they're saying. Now, what got my attention is that when I understood more about how to get rid of these voices, one of the things that helped a lot was if I could tell the patient what the voices were going to say after I did something. And that would really get their attention. So the ones I thought could handle the information, I would, as soon as I would go to tell any patient that these things were parasites, there would be an immense reaction. They would just explode into action to blot out whatever I was trying to say. You know, they did not want that concept to get through to the patient. And that was consistent. It happened every friggin' time. And soon as I went to tell a patient that these things were energetic entities, that they were draining them, and I would bring up the idea of, well, look at how many times, every time the voices come, you were drained. They would just kick to life. They did not want the patient to have that information. That was very clear. So what I started doing was trying to get as much information to the patient as I could about these things before I brought up that one aspect, because that would set them off every single time. They would go off. They would just go nuts. So I'd give them as much information as I could before getting to that point. And then I would tell them, are you hearing the voices right now? And they might say, well, no, not right now. I said, well, when's the last time you heard it? And said, well, half an hour ago or 20 minutes ago. I said, well, you're going to be hearing them in about 2 minutes. And this is what they're going to tell you. They're going to tell you, I'm stupid, I'm crazy, I'm a nutcase, don't listen to anything I got to say. Secondly, they're going to tell you to get away from me, to run, leave the ER, get away from me in whatever way. And if you don't do that, they're going to tell you to attack me. And it would be pretty much in that order. And then I would go to tell the patient. Now, there's ways you can shut them up temporarily, and I would do that. And it's strange how, but let me finish this first. That's interesting, so I'll go back to that. So I would tell the patient, this is what they're going to say as soon as in about 2 minutes. And I'll be darned if that didn't happen like clockwork. They were not able to alter their response. Mm-hmm. So if somebody told you, hey, Judith, you're going to stand on your head in 2 minutes and you're going to be spinning like a top, you go, you get out of my face, man. What are you, you're a nutcase? What are you talking about? I'm not going to do that. You're not going to make me do that. But with these things, they could not alter their response. So between those two things, it appears to be that they are somewhat robotic. They have this fixed set of attacks that they use against schizophrenic patients, and they're not able to alter whatever their program is, to adjust to that situation. So, they couldn't come back and go, and not respond at all, or not go through that list. It was like you pushed the button and they went through the list. So, yeah, to some degree, I've never been able to figure that. It's a very robotic in nature. And when you look at the responses that they're telling people, the list of lies that they have, and we have those listed in the book and in Sherry's website. I mean, it goes on for pages. It's almost like, yeah, this is the hive mind, and these are the responses that they're throwing at people. They're telling them this set of lies, and they're all negative, malicious lies. And then when they can't alter their response, it makes me wonder, there's a very robotic aspect.
It's always the same pattern.
It's always the same pattern.
Mm.
Now, psychiatry and psychology, they don't see these patterns because they're not studying hallucinations, because that would be stupid. Why would we study something that doesn't exist? But when you start seeing patterns, hallucinations don't run patterns. They're random. They're positive. They're negative. They're all over the place. They're all shades of gray. They're just all over. But these things have well-defined, irrefutable patterns. I mean, if you look at it, they run those patterns consistently. The question has to be asked is, what is it that holds them to these negative patterns? Why aren't they random like all other hallucinations? Why aren't they just all over the place? No, they're not all over the place. They're directed at destroying and upsetting the patient, and it's consistent, and it's repeatable, and you can predict it over and over again. These are not random hallucinations. These things have intent, and that intent is to drain the person of so they're parasites. They're energetic parasites, and they don't just hit schizophrenics. They hit us all.
Okay.
So, you think that covers that one?
Yeah, I think that covers. I have to say, because as you know, I interviewed Sherry as well, and we talked about that. And I thought this as well, that there is something robotic to it.
Yeah, and it's like, what is it that holds those parameters? Why, and there were patients that I did talk to that there's one female patient where the voice wasn't doing enough to destroy her, and it was replaced. It was replaced by one that was more malicious. Mm. So there are orders of magnitude to these things, and I've seen, the soldiers, and then I've seen cases where we got rid of the soldiers, and then another stronger entity would come in and kick in. You know, that was weird. So there's kind of like a military order to them. At least I could see up two levels anyway. Maybe a third one with one patient that was really spooky.
Yeah. So next question. What type of entity do you think the predator is? And would it be possible for you and Jerry to do another show to discuss the predator in more depth? Yes, we probably could do that.
Yeah, we could do that.
We are not at the top of the food chain. Humans get far more for losing.
Yes, whoever wrote that one knows it. we are. They treat us like we treat cattle.
Yeah.
You know, we go out, we eat food, we browse around and turn that food to energy. And part of that is emotional energy, and that can be positive or negative. It's the work of these things to turn that emotional energy negative, because that's the only way they can take it. They can't deal with positive energies like eating horse crap to them. I mean, they don't want to deal with it at all. Now there was a question above that. I think it said does Jerry think entity can affect more than one person at once?
Yeah, you're right.
And there was somebody who asked later on, can one schizophrenic who's hearing voices hear the voices of another schizophrenic who's also hearing voices? That was one question I had also. You know, I'm like, can they hear each other's voices? And no, they can't. You know, which was interesting. And I would ask the prisoners, I said, can you tell who is schizophrenic on the prison yard? And because, you know, most people, if they have illness, they will want to talk about that illness to other people who have that illness, you know, to kind of compare notes and for support. That's not what happened on the prison yard. They avoided one another. So several of them told me, yeah, we can sense who is hearing voices and we steer clear of them. You know, we don't, they didn't mesh. But that's not what I found with the groups that were running on the Facebook site now. They want to compare notes. So maybe, there's something different between the prisoners and the people in public. Some of them are a lot of still working. But yeah, so they can't hear each other's voices, but they can hear, you know, several voices or one or two voices. Most people have 2, 3 that they're hearing, and they could be male or female.
But can one entity affect another person at the same time?
Well, they don't affect them like they affect a schizophrenic. You know, so
another schizophrenic, maybe?
Can they affect another schizophrenic? Not directly. So.
Oh, okay.
So if I'm working, the closest I've ever come was where they directly affected me, other than that icky electrical feeling that I felt, and I could tell how strong they were and how angry they were by how much of that icky electrical charge I felt crushing my body, and that was weird. It came on slowly, but they couldn't lie to me after that. You know, I'd say, well, are you hearing voices? And they'd say, no. And I said, yes, you are, and this is how strong they are. And they'd be like, how do you know that? And I said, I can feel them. I can't hear them, I can't see them, but I can feel them. The only time, other than that, where, well, there were 2 other times. There's one time in the ER where the voices were so strong that I was thinking my field was going to collapse and wondering what would happen if it did. And I was trying to talk to this one patient, and all of a sudden my mind turned to, it was like somebody opened the top of my head and poured in a quart of syrup. I couldn't think, I couldn't concentrate. And I'm like, this is really strange, you know, and it's like, I couldn't even get my next thought. I was like, what is going on here? You know, it was really strange. I remember that. I still remember that. That only happened once, but it was like, it was like, it's like I just couldn't think anymore. Here's a patient in front of me, and I was talking to him, and I was going to tell him about these things, and all of a sudden I couldn't think. It was like, what just happened here? So, there's that icky electrical feeling. And then there was the time where I think I talked about I was asking one patient whose voices had already warned me to back away, and I didn't do that. And then the next time I brought in, it was a book by Miguel Ruiz talking about these entities being energetic parasites. And I brought this into this one patient who's a couple of weeks before that, his voices came out, and he knocked on my door in my office, and he said, the voices want to talk to you. And I think I've told this story before, and said they want to talk to me personally, and he goes, yeah, they want to talk to you personally. That's never happened before. And I sat down and said, what do they have to say? And these words came out of his mouth: you have no right to interfere with our way of life. Yeah. And I'm like, it's like Twilight Zone. It's like, what just happened? And before that, it was like, okay, the group of patients I had working with me, the requirement I had to work with them intensely was they had to tell me what their voices were saying in real time. And when the voices said something to them, I wanted to know what it was, and they would tell me. And it was usually, he's stupid, he's a jerk, don't listen to him, that kind of stuff. Or get out of here, or don't go to your appointment. But this time they came right out, and that fella said, that wasn't me who said that. He's like, I didn't say that was them. And then when I brought that was that same guy, a couple of weeks later, I brought that paragraph in from the shaman saying that they were energetic parasites, and I was going to read that to him. I brought that book into the prison and started reading it. And when I started approaching the point where the shaman was talking about them being energetic parasites, behind my head, there was this loud electrical crackle, like an arc welder, crack, 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 crack. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? And then it jumped to the wall to my left, crackled all the way up the ceiling, across to the ceiling, and back down again. And I'm asking this guy, do you hear that? And he's just staring at me like, like a zombie. And then it jumped into this Rubbermaid trash can by my left leg, and I'm staring down, and there's nothing there. I'm like, what the hell is happening here? And he gets up and he goes, I gotta leave. And I'm like, yeah, go, get out of here. And I was just like, so it scared the hell out of me. I'd never experienced anything like that. And it also opened another door. I was thinking up to that point that these things were stuck in the patient's head. They couldn't get out. That was their problem. It was in their head. It was their voices. But when that happened, it's like, hey, this is happening outside of him and outside of me. And it lasted for 20 or so seconds. It wasn't just a short burst. It was like, I couldn't smell anything. I couldn't see anything, but it was moving around. And I think I talked in one of the other interviews that after about a month, after I got done being terrified of this guy, I eventually called him in and I said, did you hear that last time you were here? And he looked good. I thought he'd be a wreck. He said, yeah, I did, but I was surprised you did. And I said, what was that? He said, that was the voices. And I asked him, well, what were they doing? He said, they were trying to scare you away. I said, well, they did a damn good job of it. And then I asked him, what were you thinking when you left the office? And he said, they were telling me to go get a shank and stick it in your gut. And I was thinking, well, I worked with this guy for like 6 months. He's not going to do anything like that. And I said, well, why didn't you do it? And he said, we couldn't find one. And I'm like, oh boy, what am I getting into here? So I wonder if that answered the question. I drifted off there.
Yeah, I guess it does.
Can it affect more than one person? So, I mean, most of the time they affect other people is through the patient who is hearing them, who is telling them, stay away from this guy. He's after you. He's rotten. You can't trust him. Don't tell him anything. He's out to get you. So they're affecting other people that way. They tear apart families. They completely tear apart families. They don't like families. They don't like children. They will go after young children and tell mothers to hurt them or kill them. And you see that in the newspaper from time to time. There was one in France where the woman threw a baby over a balcony because the voices told her to. But as far as entering somebody else's head, and no, there is one case. There is one case. Now, this was somebody whose mother was schizophrenic, and she was emotionally and psychologically abusive to this guy. And he had grown up. He was a young man, and then he had to get away from his mother because he started hearing the voices also. And it was the same ones she was hearing. And that's the only time I heard of that happening. So his mother was schizophrenic. And I think there was one question that asked, is it genetic? They say there's a genetic predisposition, but they've never been able to prove it. And they've never found the schizophrenia gene. What appears to me to be happening is that a schizophrenic parent will set up in the child the mental conditions for these things to thrive. So they will abuse them, they will torture them, and you talk to a lot of the schizophrenics and they were abused by their parents. And that sets up that negative emotional framework that these things are attracted to. And to me, that's what appears to be going on. They haven't ever identified any genetic predisposition. They say it's a genetic predisposition, but no gene. They can't find any physical cause for this thing. They've not identified. You look in the papers and it's like, oh, it's connected to this. There's a correlation between that. And it's like, you could say milk caused it. I mean, every schizophrenic drank milk. There must be milk that causes schizophrenia.
Yeah. So.
But as far as somebody else hearing the same voices that the schizophrenic is hearing, the only instance that was ever close to that was that one I just told you, where the mother, he started hearing his mother's voices after living with her for all his life. But usually like I said, they destroy families, and they mess people up that way by the behavior of the schizophrenic, and not so much by entering the person's mind and telling them to, ordering them to do something. And the only reason those medications work that the psychiatrists are giving these patients is because it calms them down. It's a lot harder for the voices to generate that negative emotional energy, and it takes energy for them to do that. So they have to have a greater return. If the patient is drugged up and calmed down, and these antipsychotic drugs are basically major tranquilizers, they gork them out. It's a lot harder to get somebody who's gorked out upset if they're drugged up and they're like, oh, well, I don't care. They don't like that. So the first thing they go after is the drugs. And so voices start telling the patients to concentrate on the side effects. Look at these bad side effects. All these bad things are happening because of these drugs. The psychiatrist is trying to poison you. I don't know how many times I've heard that. Oh yeah, stop taking the drugs because they're poison. And then you look at the assault rate of psychiatrists compared to regular doctors. It's like 3 times higher. And what's even stranger is that their suicide rate is almost exactly the same as that of schizophrenics. And that's like 4 to 5 times as higher than the normal population. So it's interesting you look at that. Here's the schizophrenics who have a suicide rate 3 to 5 times higher than the normal population, and psychiatrists have that almost that same suicide rate. And you look at the assault rate on them, compared to all other doctors, they're assaulted many times higher than regular. So it makes you wonder, the voices are telling the patient they're being poisoned by the psychiatrist, and they're attacking the psychiatrist. And the attack rate on psychiatrists is almost equal to that of attendants who spend 24 hours a day with them on the wards. They don't attack counselors, they don't attack psychologists, they don't attack nurses, they don't, they attack psychiatrists, the ones who are ordering those medications. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know, did we wander off or did we answer that question or not?
We answered it. Would you like to read the next one?
Where are we?
Jerry, it sounds like they got to you too.
They did. Yeah, they did.
Found it?
Yeah, I found it. I got some notes here. I would never go into the prison or go into the ER without praying for protection. Mm. Now, the way they got to me was that somebody I was very close to, they got hold of them and got them started using heroin. Mm-hmm. And that really torqued me out. And there was many battles with them over that. On one time they became psychotic and told this person to go to Mexico. And they were in Tijuana. We had to go find them there. And their cell phone battery was running out. When we finally found them, as I walked up to them, they took their expensive sunglasses and slammed them onto the parking lot and just went, I cursed and looked at them. I knew that was the voices that did that. And thank God in Mexico, unlike here, you can go into a pharmacy and you don't have to pay $150 to go see a psychiatrist to get a prescription for these toxic drugs that nobody wants to take. You can go in the pharmacy and order a olanzapine or Risperdal, and they sell it to you over the counter. And if they don't do it legally, you offer them a few bucks and they do it illegally, but it's not hard to get them. Here, you have to go to a psychiatrist, you have to wait months. In the meantime, here's some poor family dealing with a psychotic who they got young kids in the home, and this guy's tearing up the family and doing weird things, and they're waiting to get in to see a psychiatrist so they can prescribe them these toxic drugs that will calm them down. And then when they do, if they don't have insurance, your $150, $200 bill to see the psychiatrist, and then you go to the pharmacist and you've got to pay those guys, and then you're paying without insurance, $750 to $1,000 a month for these toxic drugs that just merely suppress the psychotic symptoms. So you're talking, somewhere in the area of $1,000 a month just to keep sane. Mm. Most people can't afford that, and they don't want to take these things anyway. Yeah, I mean, you almost have to force them to take them. They're not abusable drugs, but the drug companies and the psychiatrists are going, oh yeah, we want to keep control over this stuff because we want the money. They don't care about really curing this. They don't want to cure for it. Matter of fact, if you look at the funding for schizophrenia, in the U.S. here, what the National Mental Health Service did was they altered the statistics. They brought them down from, I don't know how many million to like 750,000 because they weren't spending hardly any money for research. So if you take the original number that they say, the number of schizophrenic patients in the US, it's in the millions, and you reduce it to like 750,000, now it looks like they're spending a tremendous amount of money on research because they altered the statistics.
So one part of that question that you just started answering is there really a way to get rid of them for good?
Yes. And that would be the you don't feed them. Bottom line, you don't feed them. So in order to do that, you have to realize that they are not who you are, and that when they're fishing for a reaction, you go, they tell you, well, you're stupid. You go, that's a lie, or you're ugly. Yeah, that's a lie. So every time they hear one of those negative thoughts come through their head, if they call it the lie that it is, they can't dig in. It's kind of like fishing. You cast a hook and you're fishing for the fish, and if he bites you, jerk it in. If you believe the lies, the negative lies these things are telling you, then they got their grip in you, and then they're going to start pointing out, well, that guy's after you, or they have more and more control. So the way this should be done is a mixture of the drugs to weaken the voices, but not to the point where they disappear. Then the application of these programs on a steady basis, to where as the voices continue to weaken, okay, so you're taking 3 milligrams of risperidone, and you can still hear the voices. You don't want to reduce the meds to the point, or increase the meds to the point where the voices completely disappear. Usually that doesn't happen anyway. You want to use these programs and the meds at the same time. So as these programs are weakening the voices, you can lower the amount of medication, these toxic medications taken, again to the point where they're just barely noticeable. And continue using these programs and lowering the medications until they're gone, until the voices are gone. And in some cases, they make a pretty dramatic leaving. I remember one case where the patient heard them scream. They just screamed and disappeared. And he said, he sat there, he looked disoriented, like he was going to fall out of the chair. And he said that the silence is deafening, because he hadn't heard silence in decades. It was always the voices. It turned out that even though we got rid of the voices, he was so lonely afterward that he went back and he looked for them, and they came back. And I'm like,
Stockholm syndrome.
yeah, go figure.
Yeah. So
did we answer that question, or we drift off?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
So even if the voices are transmitted by demons, can it not be a chemical imbalance that enables the patient to receive the messages?
I don't think so.
Because there is
now, yeah, because there is none. Now that doesn't mean that your chemistry doesn't change when you start listening to these things. You'll get depressed, and that happens. I mean, there's research out now that shows that virtually every sentence that you say or think has a chemical reaction to it. But if you're listening to the garbage these things are telling you all the time, you're no good, you're stupid, you're crazy, you don't fit in, then you're going to get depressed, and that's going to change your chemical imbalance. Now, and then they're going to give you these antidepressants, which are, they say, serotonin reuptake blockers. So what happens is, the serotonin triggers that electrical charge between the brain cells. And after it's released, it's destroyed normally. So it can't keep triggering the cells to keep firing. But what happens is these drugs don't allow that destruction, and they keep firing. And even so, then they get, the nervous system goes, this is too much, and it starts shutting it down, so that they do get depressed. And research shows that if that goes on long enough, it does change your genetic makeup. Dr. Joe Dispenza talks about that. There's a number of people now that are talking about that. Greg Braden shows that how you think changes your actual genetic makeup. So if there is a genetic predisposition, it would come from how you think. And there's people who are now measuring brain waves, and I've heard there's a way they can measure consciousness even, or the charge on certain sentences. So yeah, it will affect your chemical imbalance in your body. I mean, once you get depressed, your chemical makeup is no longer the same way it was when you're normal. But as far as, you know, transmitting a chemical imbalance, they don't cause the chemical imbalance. Your thinking does, and if you buy into their thoughts as your thoughts, yeah, your chemical balance is going to change. And it's not because they're directly changing that balance. You're changing it by buying into their thoughts or negative thinking in general.
Jerry has spoken about the entities/demons wanting to take souls to the pit. It would be great to hear more detail on this.
That one, okay, here. That one was kind of a misnomer. The actual situation with that one was not entities taking people's souls to the pits. There was a period of time where, before I felt I shouldn't do this any longer, where I was actually talking to these voices like Van Dusen did. And there was one I was speaking to who said, yeah, he was sent to destroy this particular patient. And he was telling me that if he failed, he would be sent to the pit. You know, and I didn't know what the pit was. So it wasn't like, you know, they were taking souls to this pit. And you know, the Christian religion, I think one of the most fallacious factors there is the idea of fear. You know, that's what these things are. They are fear. They generate fear. They are fear. So when you say, they say, well, fear God, you know, who do you trust who you fear? I mean, do you trust anybody that you fear? No, I don't either. So that's mostly in the New Testament or the Old Testament. The New Testament is more a loving God, but still they're programmed with, especially with the Catholic religion, you know, do what we say or you're going to burn in hell forever.
Yeah, but you find hell in other religions as well.
Yeah, in other religions as well.
I have, fear has nothing to do there. You know, if you have a literal father-son, father-daughter relationship, and you, as the daughter, as the son, you fear your father, then that relationship is deeply disturbed. Sorry. Yeah,
I agree. Let me see, what else did I have? That I know I had that list. Let me see, we're done this first list. Where are we now with the list?
I can read it. Maybe you see it. He mentioned something about black entities or spirits hovering over the buildings of bars, feeding off the energies of the alcoholics. Could he expand on that?
Yeah, now that's interesting. Well, anybody who's been around a chronic alcoholic or had to live with one can see that they completely change when they're drunk. You know, a lot of times there's people who use an awful lot of alcohol aren't usually friendly alcoholics. You know, and the family members will tell you he completely changes. He's not the same. He's not the same person. It's like something else takes over him. And I've seen that a number of times. Where this came from was when I was working in the prison, and there was an Apache Indian. I don't know if you guys have heard about the Apaches over there in Germany.
Sure.
They're particularly nasty warriors. I mean, they held off the U.S. Army back in the 1800s and defeated them in a number of cases. But this guy was an Apache Indian on the Apache reservation, and he was kind of like this evil Indian medicine man. So he wasn't just your regular Apache. And he was so violent and so drunk that they were sending him directly from the reservation straight to the prison, and he was going to the unit where I was working. So I heard about him coming, and I started tracking him because I'm like, I'm never going to meet somebody like this again. I want to get to know this guy and how he operates. So here he comes crashing through Alhambra, which is a classification center. Usually they'd stop there, and they'd be classified, and they'd spend a few days in the classification center and then move on to whatever unit they're going to. This guy just come crashing right through the entire system, tracking him on the computer, just bam, 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 bam. And here he is on my unit. So when he arrived, I called him in and said, I'm going to be your psych. I'm going to be checking in on you once a month to see how you're doing, see your meds are doing okay, and I'll be tracking you. And man, he looked at me like, this like I'd rather just cut your gut open and spill them all over the room than say another word to you. And I'm like, okay. So let him go. And then I went over to they have the different gangs on the prison yard. So I went over to the leader of the Indian gang, who was a real meek Navajo. He was badly diabetic. And I got along with the Indians really well. And I asked the head of the Indians, I said, what's with this guy? I mean, what's going on here? And he goes, you be very careful with him. And I'm like, okay. So I kept calling him in once a month. And, slowly, after about 6 months, I could talk to him for maybe 15 minutes without him starting to ramp up. And finally, one day, I asked him, he was telling me all this weird stuff, spirits chasing him and how he could cast spells on different people and, all these supernatural stories. And, I'm listening to him and you could feel, I mean, he was, as far as he's concerned, he was telling the truth. And I'm taking all this in. And then finally, one day I asked him, well, if you can do all that stuff, how come you can't stay sober? And I was like, kind of, all right, what's he going to do with that one? And I was halfway expecting an explosion. He didn't do that. He said, I can't stay sober because of the spirits of dead alcoholics. He said that if I drink anything, they're right there. They just leap in and they start taking over, and they're bothering me even before I get to the point of taking a drink by putting the thoughts to drink in my head. And I've spoken to hundreds and hundreds of alcoholics where they go building up to a drink, process where they start, oh, I can walk near that bar. Then I can go in that bar and not drink anything. And maybe I can just have one. And it just, that their thinking goes right down that line in little incremental steps until they start drinking again. And this guy told me about his girlfriend who was also alcoholic, who these things walked her into traffic, and he watched her get killed by a truck. But he told me about one bar in Phoenix where he said these spirits were so high over that particular bar that they disappeared up into the sky. They just disappeared. They were so high. He said if he went anywhere near that bar, they would start jumping on him and getting him to go in there. And he said what happens is that they haven't left the earth plane, and they can't get drunk without using somebody else's body because now they're in spiritual form. But they want to get. They want to get.
In other words, they might have been alcoholics themselves.
They were. That's what he's saying. They were dead alcoholics. And he said they can't get drunk unless they can use somebody else's body to get drunk with. And that explains a lot. When you think about it. And I would tell that to alcoholics, and a lot of them would go, yeah, it's not me, it's not just me who's drinking. And that makes a huge difference to them. you know, because it's just like with the psychiatrist saying, yeah, it's all your fault. You know, you've got a chemical imbalance, and you know, they're also telling alcoholics, yeah, you're an addict. It's a disease. It's all your fault. You got to stop drinking. But when you realize that you're not the only one drinking, and that these entities want to drink also, it's like, okay, I got to be a little more careful here. And you look at AA, and that's a spiritual program. You know, it's they call the higher power. They're asking the higher power to come in and help them with this. And you talk about the negative emotional energy. I mean, alcoholics generate a massive amount of that. You know, they're getting in accidents, they're beating their kids, they're abusing their wives, they're getting fired from their jobs. And drugs and alcohol are one way to these things. What they actually do is tell schizophrenics, like, get off of those stupid drugs the doctor's giving you, and go take some alcohol. You know, drink alcohol, or go take meth, or use heroin. I mean, it'll feel a whole lot better to you than this crap that they're giving you, and it'll calm you down. And you know, they're convinced, but what they're after is the addictive withdrawal effect afterward, which creates a ton of negative emotional energy. And virtually all schizophrenics are also dealing with some kind of drug problem in one way or another. You know, they're trying to self-medicate rather than use the drug psychiatry it's given them. There were a number of cases where I've talked to prisoners who had blacked out, and they ended up in a town 100, 150 miles away from where they started out. They didn't even remember how they got there. You know, they're like, where am I? They woke up in the morning in their car. Where am I? How did I get here? There was one I remember said, you know, I woke up in the morning and there was blood all over the bumper of my car, and he didn't know what he hit or who he hit. So the question is, who was doing the driving? You know, these guys are out of it. They're drunk out of their minds. Who was doing the driving?
Yeah. So my question is concerning OCD. Is it hereditary? Several family members, including myself, my son, who is also diagnosed with autism as well. First family line, generational demons, tormenting thoughts.
All right, so I remember that. I remember that OCD question. I don't know if I've written down an answer to it. Let me make sure I'm on the same page with you here. What is the first question your page starts with?
My question is concerning OCD. Is it hereditary?
No. What's? I'm trying. I got like 2 pages here.
I just opened the email that I sent you. I haven't printed it out.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, here it is. I got it. Is it hereditary? As far as genetically, I don't think so. Now, it may be, you know, if you're raised with somebody who's OCD, it's kind of like you're thought to be that way. And that would change any genetic predisposition, but I don't think it's genes that cause that. And I think we've all been stressed to a point where we get that way, and that program where you just, like cleaning, you know, a lot of people when they get stressed and have the OCD stuff, they start cleaning or washing their hands. It's kind of a.
For those listeners who do not know what OCD is, could you elaborate?
Well, what that is you.
What does it stand for, OCD?
What was it? OCD. It's getting caught in the same pattern over and over again. you're obsessed with something. Like these people who have a desk that's so neat that if you go in there and you move one thing a couple of inches, they come back to the room and they go boom, and it goes back there. So these are responses like cleaning over and over again, or washing your hands. You become obsessed with washing your hands over and over again. It's repeating a ritual.
Like compulsive behavior?
Like compulsive, yeah, it's compulsive behavior. So, you know, I guess the shamans would say, yeah, there might be generational demons to that. But if you look at how they think, that's the way they handle anxiety. You know, they go into a ritual kind of thing. If they're worried about germs, they wash their hands over and over again until their skin is raw. Whatever they're worried about, they try to head it off. You know, oh, I'm going to get sick, so they try to keep their house clean over and over again. But if you look at how they're thinking, you know, it's a fear they're trying to handle. They're trying to cope with that fear by running a ritual, and that can become very dysfunctional when you get caught up in it. But I don't think they found any kind of gene for any kind of mental illness at all. Matter of fact, they have no test for any mental illness. They have no lab tests. They have nothing that they can point to. Every single one of those diagnoses in the DSM is all made up. This group of psychiatrists get together and they make up these illnesses. It started with something like 161 back in, you know, when they first started coming out with this dictionary of mental disorders, and last it was up above 300, and they just keep making these things up. Every single one of them is made up. You know, so they go OCD, you know, okay, here's the symptoms. They got the symptoms. They don't have any cause, and they don't have any treatment for it, other than their toxic drugs. So what they do is they give these OCD guys stuff like these phenothiazines that, like Librium, Librax, you know, and those are addictive. And then they become addicted on these drugs, and you know, they're still worked out. It doesn't cure anything. What do they call it? This cognitive behavioral therapy would be the way to go with something like this. And that's a precursor to what we've put out here, is to deal with the thoughts that generate the behavior, because no behavior is generated without a thought. You got to have a thought first. So if you're being obsessive compulsive, and that's, you know, so OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder. If you're being obsessive and get involved with an obsessive behavior, what are you thinking that is triggering that obsessive behavior? So it all boils down to your thinking. I mean, the behavior is generated by the thought, and then that behavior feeds that thought, and it just goes into a circular pattern where you're just trapped by it. So they start cleaning the house and they feel better while cleaning the house, and then they stop cleaning the house and the obsessive thoughts start coming back, so they start cleaning the house again and they feel better while they're cleaning the house and or washing the hands, and it's like very dysfunctional. It's all driven by their thoughts.
Okay, so Jerry, how do you keep yourself clean from these energies and entities from entering or disturbing you during or after sessions? Have you ever experienced attachment or interference from your clients' attachments? Has any ever followed you home or attached to your aura?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's ever followed me home. Yes, there was one time. What I was used to was, you know, I was talking about that icky electrical feeling that I felt when these voices were upset with me. There are times where they did follow me home, and it shocked the hell out of me. It started off in the early days after when I knew enough to help these guys get rid of these voices. And they were recovering. They were fully recovering. The voices were gone completely. They weren't being bothered by them. They were put on a positive spiritual path and they were moving onward. Every time the voices left and they were cleared at about 3 in the morning, and this happened, I don't know, about 4 or 5 times, I felt like I was being crushed into the bed at night. And it was terrifying. I mean, I'm laying there and I'm asleep and here's something crushing me into the bed and I could feel it. And I prayed like the Dickens and it would finally move away. And then there was one time where one prisoner recovered and I was laying there and I heard this loud explosion like a firecracker going off right next to my ear. It woke me up from a sound sleep and I jump up and I'm like, what was that? And here's my wife next to me. She's dead asleep. She didn't hear anything. And I'm like, well, what's going on there? And then my son in the next room over, he goes, what was that? So he had heard it. I heard it. And she slept right through it.
It was not meant for her.
No, it wasn't meant for her, or she wasn't at the frequency where she could pick up that. Then there was another time where I was on my roof meditating. You know, usually, you know, I hadn't been attacked by those things unless a patient had recovered. You know, and then I was kind of braced for it. You know, okay, this might happen tonight. But this time it was, you know, I'd already retired and I was up on my roof meditating. Then boom, here comes that icky electrical feeling. I'm like, where'd that come from? I'm not dealing with anybody, you know, like, yeah. So, you know, they have followed me home. Now cleaning, you know, I would always pray before I went into the ER or went into the prison. You know, I'd pray for protection and I'd surround myself with white light, and I'd ask my guardian angels to protect me. And I wasn't even sure I had any till one day, and this was in a hospital ER, where I was working with a female patient, and she looks at me and she goes, "You're never going to be hurt by any of these patients." And she was hearing voices too, and I said, "That came out of nowhere." And I said, "Well, where did that come from? What, you know, what makes you say that?" And she goes, "Well, I can see this huge angel. He's right behind you. He's giant." And I'm like, "Yeah?" And he goes, "Yeah, I can see him right now." So, and I never have been hurt by a patient, where a number of my colleagues have, or have been threatened. One guy got put out of work for a while. So I always felt that I was being protected. Let me see what other answer I had here. Oh, I would also have a medicine bag that I couldn't bring into the prison with me because they would immediately pick up on that. But I would carry a crystal around in my pocket. I would do that. You know, I'd have to watch my negative thoughts. And you know, the negative thoughts would be the big one, because for me, working in the prison, it wasn't the prisoners who were my biggest problem. It was the administration. It was the staff. And I would grate against the staff. And so I'd have to watch my thoughts there. So yeah, you do have to protect yourself from these things, and it's not just me protecting. I'd encourage the patients to ask their guardian angels for strength and help also. There were a number of times where, when they were able to do that, the voices would temporarily disappear. But what was strange is when you say, okay, ask your guardian angels for help to get rid of the voices, they would automatically ask for strength. They'd say, give me the strength to get rid of the voices. And I said, no, they'll take it. You don't pray for strength. You ask them to help you get rid of the voices. And in a lot of cases, they would disappear temporarily once they asked for that help. It was almost as if you ask, look, you'll see it. Here it is. You'll see it. This is a spiritual battle. This is not a physical battle. And what was interesting was there was a period of time, like I started out telling you, I was actually talking to these things, and what I would find was that if you vividly imagined putting them into a cast, that would happen wherever they're at. So in order to get through to them, I mean, the voices saw me as a threat. They didn't like me. When they saw what I was doing, they would ramp up and just try to drown out whatever I was trying to tell the patient, including that they were parasites. So there had to be a way to shut them up so I could get through to the patient. And I started experimenting with some stuff. And the first thing I found was that if I imagined a huge explosion of white light inside of the patient, blasting these things out, and then a web of light, grabbing them and throwing them into a prison of light with walls, 3 feet thick. I found that any physical effect that they were having on the patient, like the anxiety or headaches or sweating or that kind of thing, would stop immediately. But it didn't shut them up. So they would say, okay, my headache's gone, or okay, I feel calmer now, or the physical effects would disappear once I'd done that, but they would still be able to talk through those walls of light and still hurl insults at the patient. So, I mean, this sounds really bizarre, but it worked. So I vividly imagined them being duct tape, being wrapped around their head and around their mouth so they couldn't talk. And for the most part, they shut up after that, except for one guy reported that he heard him going like you would have if you had on your mouth. And I found that interesting. So thoughts do have an effect on these things. And I think that's part of the reason when you repeat the 23rd Psalm, which is a high vibration prison, they hate that. They rebel against that. It's like one patient said it was like throwing worms on a hot frying pan when you repeat the 23rd Psalm over and over and over again. And what I've done all my career is whatever irritated them, I'd say give them more of the same. Now I had to watch that at the state hospital because it's like, you don't upset psychotic patients because you never know exactly what they're going to do. But in the prison, acting out was, a patient complaining that somebody from psych was asking questions about his voices and that was upsetting them. That wouldn't even hit that would not even be considered an issue in the prison. I mean, it's like, that wouldn't even break the ambient noise level.
What is very strange? Sirens are going off here. Usually when they are testing them, they are doing it not late in the evening. They test them during daytime.
Sirens?
Yeah. Like when...
like an air raid siren?
What?
Like an air raid siren?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Still going on. Maybe it's just a glitch.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, they test them once in a while, but usually not after 10 p.m.
Well, I could see that happening here after recent developments, but you guys weren't involved with that.
So, yeah, and then we have the question about the electrical discharge.
Oh, where that came from was when I was working with Dr. Van Dusen. He was a clinical psychologist who was actually talking to the voices in, probably the only one, in California when he was working. when I started running into these results, I hunted him up and said, yeah, well, listen, you know, I'm seeing the same things you did, only I've gone further into the house, and I'm seeing that these things are not only, they're not friendly, they're trying to destroy these people. So what Van Dusen did is he tried to befriend the voices, trying to learn about them. So he was like, oh, I'm not going to hurt you, just tell me what's going on. And he tried to be friends with them. And he even got him to take some psych tests. He got him to take a Rorschach and an MMPI, independent of the patient. So what he'd say, you know, they tell the patient, don't let your voices answer any of these questions. And then he give them a second set of tests, and he goes, this test is only for your patients. It's not for your voices, not for you. So don't you answer any of these. And he said that the test came out more psychotic for the voices than they did with the patient. So he took a totally different tack than I did. I always knew these things were rotten and they were no good and they were trying to kill my patients. He was trying to befriend them, and he would hold these long conversations with them. So how did I drift off here? What was the original question?
Yeah.
Oh, the static electricity.
Yeah.
So what he did is he sent me this book called 30 Years Among the Dead that was printed somewhere in the 1920s by a psychiatrist. Now, this psychiatrist's wife was a psychic, and what he would do, he had a static electricity generator, so it would generate static shocks like you get from your rug in the winter. And he would give his schizophrenic patients who were hearing voices shocks with this static electrical generator. And he reported that his patients told him that those shocks were felt by the voices like these nasty electrical storms. And they were very painful. They were much more painful for the voices than they were for the patient. And his patients reported that the voices would then leave the patient, and then his wife would pick up on them and talk them into the light. And once they walked into the light, that voice was gone. Mm. So here's Van Dusen sending me all these articles for static electrical generators saying, well, hey, man, this might work with your patients in the prison. And I said, yeah, and it might get me fired real quick, too. So I'm like, I can imagine that. Oh, yeah, the psychologist is shocking his patients in there, man. But now they can do that with their ECT machines. They can run 450 volts. The psychiatrist can do that with their patients. But if a psychologist is doing static electric shocks on patients, oh, he's going to be fired. You can bet on that. So here I am thinking, like, okay, what can I use that would have a similar effect? And I was standing in front of the secretary's desk one time, and here's this rubber band there. And that might do it. So I took the rubber band and I gave it to one of my patients who was hearing voices, and I'd already given him the 23rd Psalm. But what I found is that by the next week, they had lost their 23rd Psalm, or the voices would carry them off and distract them, and they wouldn't repeat it. You know? So there was an active influence away from repeating that 23rd Psalm, and the voices were responsible for that. So what I did was gave them the rubber band. I said, as soon as you hear the voices, as soon as you realize they're there, snap the rubber band on your wrist, which would cause like a shock. You know, that snap, it would cause like a shock. And I found that they all came back reporting that once they did that, that shock shut their voices up for 20, 30 seconds maybe. You know, the voices just went quiet when they bam. And then they would repeat the 23rd Psalm. And that gave them some control over the voices that they'd never had before. Even though it wasn't enough to get rid of them, it was a way for them to strike back and take matters into their own hands. Well, if you're going to torture me, I can get you this way. Some of them slapped that rubber band so many times their wrist came back red. You know, most of them broke the rubber bands, and we had to give them another one. When the chief psychologist found out I was doing that, he ordered me to stop. but it did work. So the guy who wrote, I forgot who wrote it, The 30 Years Among the Dead, he was using the electrical shocks. And then I wondered, Tesla put out something called the violet ray, which gives static electric shocks. And you can get one for about $100. I was always curious about what would happen if somebody were to get one of those and use it.
Yeah, but the question was actually about that electrical discharge that went up the ceiling, ended up in the waste bucket.
Yeah, that was the one I talked about earlier.
Mm.
I'd never experienced that again. That was a one-time deal.
Okay, good. Good. So then we have, would you please bring up this possibility that laughter in people as well as in animals that seem to laugh while they are playing is a type of seizure, like in epilepsy, where neural pathways and passages seem to be unsettled. Laughter too causes our pretty nearly entire neural electrical systems to become scrambled, but with good results. Perhaps because that is precisely why the creator invented or instituted this wondrous thing, laughter, like she invented sleep and dreaming.
Well, one thing I have seen is that the voices don't like laughter, funny laughter. They don't find hardly anything funny, and if the patient does, they put a squash to it real quick, and they will actually drive people away from funny people. They don't want them being around positive people. They'll just push them away. They don't like laughter because it is such a positive thing. Now, on the other hand, there's the psychotic patients who there's this crazy evil laughter to them where they laugh at nothing. That's a different kind of laughter. It's not like, the laughter from a good joke or the laughter from something happened. It's more this malicious, kind of sickening laughter. It's like an evil laughter. But yeah, the voices don't like the patient feeling good. They don't like him hanging around positive people. They'll turn anything to crap.
But would you say it's a seizure?
Well, I haven't experienced it as a seizure. I mean, I'm not a neuropsychologist, but I'm sure there would be a change in brain waves if you were to measure it on the brainwave frequency. But it's a good thing. The voices don't like people laughing. They don't like them feeling good, and they're going to steer. You could take a schizophrenic into one of the funniest comedians in the universe, and he might giggle at something maybe once in a while, but for the most part, he's going to be just flat, like, that wasn't funny. Unless somebody got hurt. That would be funny. But yeah, I've never experienced laughter as a seizure.
Yeah, me not either.
I mean, there's sometimes I laugh so hard my sides hurt and I was crying. I mean, that happened. It's like, but I didn't want to control it. It was great.
Yeah. So, what can you tell us about the possession itself when the entity takes full control of a human? Do all possessions necessarily involve hearing voices, or could someone be possessed without hearing voices?
Well, the ones I dealt with, the most, I've never seen anybody. I mean, maybe The Exorcist has. And we're talking. There's two things here. There's obsession, and then there's possession. So obsession is where they are interfering with your thinking, and that would be with people who are depressed. they don't see anything as funny. They see the world as gloomy. Their thoughts are gloomy. Their thoughts are negative. In those cases,
like very, very pessimistic.
Very pessimistic, very negative. Nothing is funny. They don't see anything good on the horizon. I mean, they're just very negative people. Those you might say, okay, there's an obsession there. There's something driving their thinking in a negative direction, but they're not necessarily psychotic and acting out in strange ways. They obey the laws. They don't hurt people. They don't get in serious trouble. Now complete possession is really rare, and that was the case I told you about earlier, where the patient said, "I'm not your son. I am this guy. I'm somebody else now." That's extremely rare. But what the voices do is they will move in there and they will slowly keep hammering away, taking more and more control. So
that the original personality fades?
Yes. Okay. And they take over. So what Castaneda said is that they give us their minds. And they do that by inserting negative thoughts that you believe are your own. And if you buy into that, they do more and more and more and more. And there's always a battle that goes on between these voices and the original personality. That especially if they understand that these voices are not who they are. The ones who don't understand that, they're just in a massive confusion. It's like, what's going on? I don't understand what's happening. I'm messed up. I'm crazy. I don't have a handle on what's happening with me. But the ones who do understand that, they know it's a battle going on. These things are trying to take over control of their thought stream. They're inserting negative, destructive thoughts. They're telling them to do things that are destructive. And one thing you'll see with schizophrenic patients, it's almost like they can't stand to succeed. As they approach succeeding at anything, they sabotage themselves. I've seen that over and over at the state hospital, where we put them into a vocational program, and they're just about to graduate when they go off their meds, and then they start doing all this stupid stuff and they get thrown out. So you'll see them sabotage themselves over and over and over again, and do self-destructive things that are they know are self-destructive. And that produces that negative emotional energy that these things feed off of. And with the kind of the obsessive compulsive thing, if a female was raised with an abusive father, that's going to be her role model. She'll go out into life and she will subconsciously attract abusive males into her life. And that's the way she's taught it should be. And she will continue to do that until she realizes she's the one that's bringing them in. And it's a subconscious thing. I don't know how many female alcoholics or females I talk to who they married an alcoholic husband who was abusive and nasty, and they divorced that one, and they go, never again, I'm not going to do this again. And then they find another one, and they can't even tell the guy's drinking or he has a serious problem. And then he turns out to be an alcoholic, and they divorce that one, and then they attract another one. So it happens almost subconsciously.
Okay, so now we have a longer question. The voices that the patients would hear, did the patients identify the voices with any detail that is beyond telling the patient what to do? Example, did the voices sound like male or female, or were they both? Did the voices claim to be family members of the patient, or did the voices claim anything at all? Again, not asking what the voices would tell the patients to do. Again, not asking what the voices would tell them. Okay. So did the voices say they were a religious figure, or did they say they are demons, angels, elves? anything like this? Did the patients report paranormal experiences beyond auditory? What was the frequency in which the patients reported paranormal activity beyond voices? Wow.
Yeah, wow. So that ran off of my page. So, well, yeah. Okay, let's start into that one. Did the patients identify the voices with any detail beyond telling them what to do? Well, they were experiencing them as voices, and they could tell the difference between male and female voices in most cases. Mm-hmm. You know, you ask them, are the voices male or female, and they'll tell you, well, they're all male, or there's one female and two males, or there's two females, and then I would ask them, well, what are they telling you to do? So I want to find out what these voices are up to, and the females can be just as vicious as the males. So yeah, the voices are both male and female, mm-hmm. And they vary in number. Did the voices claim to be family members, or did the patient, or did they claim anything at all? There were two cases, and this was very devastating, where the patient, and these were both females, were very badly physically and sexually abused as children, and by their this family member, a bad family member, and then when that family member died, they were very relieved. It was like, okay, finally this asshole is gone. And I remember one telling me they were at that person's funeral, and a voice came back in their head. And I remember I told you they have access to all your memories. And so a voice came to this person who wasn't hearing voices prior to this, and it identified itself as the abusive person who was deceased and laying there dead, and saying, no, you haven't got rid of me. You know, I'm back. And don't you remember when you did this and we did that? And so they have access to the person's memory. So they can pull all this stuff up, and nobody else except the patient and that sexually abusive family member knew this stuff. And then the voice would tell them, I'm back. I'm your uncle or whoever, and I'm back. You haven't got rid of me. And boy, you don't think that sends the shivers, mm-hmm. you know, up their spine. And that happened twice. That happened twice. And it's very, you talk about generating tons of negative emotional energy. That's very frightening. It's like, finally this nightmare is over. And then they go, no, it's not. It's back. And so I'd tell them, no, that's not your deceased somebody. That's these voices, and this is what they're trying to do. But yeah, there were two cases like that where they claimed to be other family members. So remember, they can go into your memory and they can pick out every rotten thing that's ever happened, and they know these things. Let me see. Did the voices claim to be anything at all? Yeah, what they claim to be, and I've had a number of patients ask them, you know, who are you? You know, what are you? Guess what they would be told? Take a guess.
I don't know.
They say
it could be a number of things.
No, what it actually is they say, we are you.
Ah, okay. We
are you, plural. Mm. So that's what they want you to believe, is that they are who you are. Mm. Remember, Castaneda said they give us their mind. Mm. And if they can get you to believe that you are who they are, then they start taking increased control. And that's with everybody. I mean, you know, you get a negative thought and they say, well, you know, that guy's a jerk. You know, you got to put him in his place. Okay, so that you do that and it creates negative emotion.
Some guys are jerks.
Some guys are jerks. But remember, whatever you see in somebody else, you got that in you. You know, so you can use that productively. So you see a guy who's a jerk and you go, well, that guy's a jerk and he's a jerk because of this. And then you can go, well, what is it in me where I'm a jerk in the same way? And then once you find what that is and you go, okay, I'm going to get rid of that, then those jerks disappear from your life and a whole new set of jerks come in. You know?
Yeah, or
so,
they can no longer anchor.
Or they no longer
identify them earlier.
Right. Or they don't set off that reaction any longer because you've cured that in you. So once these traumas are cured in the person, and once they come to grip with them and they're no longer acting at a deeper level where they're triggering this dysfunctional behavior subconsciously, these things can bring that up, you know, that you wouldn't have access to. And so do the jerks, like you're talking about. They bring that stuff up that you normally wouldn't have access to. And the ego goes, no, 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 I don't want to deal with that. That's not me, that's them. They're the jerks. You know? And like we said, a little bit of it in you would require a lot of it in somebody else, or the vice versa. A lot of it in you would just require a little bit to set you off. So they would claim, the voices would claim that they are you. They are the person.
Yeah. Okay. Do they also claim they are demons, angels, elves, or anything like that?
Very seldom do they claim they're demons, but they have said that, you know, to some people. What they want you to believe is that they are you. And they don't want a dichotomy. It's like you know, terrorists. They blend into the population, so you can't find them. And then they come out and do their damage. These things are the same way. They blend into your thought processes, and then they come out and they hit you. You know, they don't want you to see that they're separate from who you are. That they claim they're religious figures. Yeah, they'll claim they're Christ. And since they, you know, some of them do have supernatural powers. And usually it's for bad. I had a number of prisoners tell me that they would tell them which houses to rob. The drug addicts would be told where to go to meet somebody with the drugs. I remember dealing with one where his voices would tell him which houses to rob and when to be there, and generally where the loot was. Not exactly where it was, but generally. And they would go in there and they'd rob the house and they'd get away with it. He said one time he had robbed the house. The voices told him that the people who lived in the house were up and he'd better get out of there. So he jumped through the window and he started running to the left down this one alley. The voices said, no, don't go down that alley because the cops are coming up that alley. So he went in another direction, and sure enough, the cops were coming up that alley. So the voices told him, you know, go jump in this trash bin. There's this big metal trash bin. And he jumped in that bin and closed the top. And he was hiding in garbage in there as a cop walked by with his flashlight and his gun. And as soon as the cop got past, he said the voices told him to jump out of there and get out. He goes, no, he's just 10 feet away. I can't go now. And they said, yeah, you go. And he closed the lid quietly. Go now. So he did. And he ran. He got back to his apartment. And the voices said, good job. You did a real good job. And he said, no, I didn't. You know, he said, I left the loot in the trash can. You know,
what about paranormal experiences beyond auditory?
Well, that was one where they tell them, you know, where to go, who to rob, where to be.
Yeah. Right. Sorry. So, and the last part is, what was the frequency in which the patients reported paranormal activity beyond voices?
What was the frequency?
That is the last question of this longer one.
Oh, okay. So what he's asking is how many of the voices could do paranormal stuff like that? Is that what the question is?
No, it says, what was the frequency in which the patients reported paranormal activity beyond voices?
You mean due to the voices or otherwise? Oh, okay.
I don't know.
Well, okay. I would say that, you know, most of them did not report these kind of paranormal events where the voices knew stuff. Maybe a third would do that. And there was one story where the patient was told by his voices, I think I told this one before, to get all this money and drive from San Diego here all the way up to Oregon, and the voices would show them where a big pot field, Sesamelia pot field was. And this guy followed the directions of his voices, found the pot field. Didn't I tell you that story before? I didn't tell you that one? That's a strange one. You want me to tell you that one? Or you want to move on?
I would like to move on.
Okay. Where are we?
So, can toxic energies convincingly suggest an unfit future spouse? Meaning, would they steer to a traumatized person, another traumatized individual? So there would be a case of blind leading a crippled, and they both never get better emotionally, mental-wise.
Yeah, well, I think we touched on this before, where you're going to attract, however you were treated as a kid by your mom or your dad. You're going to women are going to look for males who like their father, and males are going to look like toward for females who, because that's what they're comfortable with, even though it may be awful and the abuse they went through is awful. That's what they're used to. That's what they're comfortable with, and they prefer that to the unknown. So you got that, and yeah, once you feel that you deserve that kind of treatment, or that's what you're used to, you will attract that to you. So we talked about the case of alcoholic husbands, where the female would attract them over and over and over again. So it's almost like they bring them in.
Okay, so my question relates to intergenerational schizophrenia. My ex-husband has schizophrenia, and I left him and took our 2 children because as time progressed, he became more and more hateful towards me and was neglectful of the children. My youngest son was 11 when we left and is now 25. I worry that he is showing the same onset signs that his father did. Is there entities that target generations of the same family? Is there things that I can do to help my son? Are there things?
Yeah, there are.
Yeah, okay. Are these entities able to affect others in the home as well? As I struggle with depression.
Well, that's a long one, but the first thing I want to tell this person is don't feel bad about leaving the schizophrenic husband, because the voices hate children. They just hate children, and I don't know how many times I've seen them just really mess up children. And even Emanuel Swedenborg even talked about this, the Christian mystic, how badly they hate children. So this mother it was good she followed her instincts and got out of there, because that schizophrenic husband, especially if he didn't want help, would have ended up destroying them. They would have been a mess, and she would have been even worse of a mess. And then with regard to the genetic predisposition, I think we kind of talked about that earlier, where it looks like it's more a setup. So the schizophrenic father would have kept abusing her son or daughter, whoever, and would have continued to do that until they got to the point where they were ready to be a host for these voices. And the chances, and it usually happens around 25 years old. And I don't know why that is. It's usually, if they're going to break, they usually break at about that age. So I don't think it's a genetic predisposition. They've never found a genetic marker for that. I think it's more the schizophrenic sets up the conditions for these things to infest other family members. They create a negative mindset in the child.
Mm-hmm.
And I told the story about that, where the son had to actually leave the mother because the schizophrenic mother, he was starting to hear her same voices, and then when he left, they disappeared. Do they affect others in the household? Again, they don't affect them usually by directly, the mother would not be hearing these voices that the child hears, but they would cause the child to behave in such a way that it would badly affect the mother. So you talk to some of these families who have a schizophrenic family member, it just tears the family up. It's like having an alcoholic in the family. Everybody's upset. Everybody's fearful. It destroys the family. The voices do not like families. They do not like children. And what can she do to help her son? There's a lot of things. First of all, don't engage with anger. So when the son does something to tick her off, don't blast him and get angry, because that only feeds this. Set the parameters, and if he breaks the parameters, then do whatever, put him in timeout, or there has to be repercussions, but don't beat him up, and don't engage with anger, because that feeds this. Set firm guidelines and make sure he knows that he's loved, because these things will tell the victim, they'll tell the kid if they're active, oh, she doesn't love you, she's just pretending she does. I don't know if you have Boy Scouts or Cub Scouts over there in Germany, but I would highly recommend she get the kid involved in Boy Scouts.
I don't think she is in Germany.
You don't have Boy Scouts in Germany?
I said this.
Oh, she's not in Germany.
No.
Oh,
I didn't have the impression that she is in Germany.
Oh, well, if they have Boy Scouts or Cub Scouts, I'd highly recommend she get the kid involved there, where he has a good, stable male figure, and they're teaching positive values, and they're around other kids who are having fun. Stay away from violent video games. Don't let the kid play violent video games or watch violent TV shows, because that just feeds it. It feeds it all. You look, by the time a kid here in the U.S. gets to be a teenager, he's already watched 15,000 murders on TV. And then they go, oh no, we got to take the guns away. But they still, yeah, this is how you deal with your problems. You take a gun and you go shoot somebody, and these guys are your heroes. And you look up these advertisements for the movies, and they're always shooting people. It's insane, and then they blame it on the guns and disarm the population. Keep them productively occupied. Empty space, boredom allows these things to enter. But if they're productively occupied, it doesn't give them any room. Keep them away from bad kids, and use the That's a Lie program for both herself on her depression. When she has a negative thought, and she knows it's not true, that's a lie, that's a lie. Teach a kid to do the same thing every time he has a negative thought. That's a lie.
Great, thank you. So,
did we cover it?
Yes.
Okay.
Toxoplasma gondii parasite that exists in cats. Can they enter and infect the brain of humans?
Well, I'm no expert on that. I did hear that this toxoplasma stuff can affect the brain of humans.
Okay.
But I've never dealt with a patient who blamed it on a cat. There's something to it, and from what I understand, it's a correlation again. It's not they haven't ever found a cause and effect thing. From what I understand, it's a correlation. So.
Okay. So, I live in a city with many crazed homeless who I guess see and hear things that we can't. If one man interacts with an entity only he can see, could someone else with the same illness interact with the same entity as the other man? What I mean is, could two persons with schizophrenia see the same entity?
You know, that's a very interesting question. And we talked about that a little earlier. So they don't hear the same voices. Schizophrenics, now the ones who hear the voices, they don't hear the same voices. They don't see the same things. But there's another entity out there, and I'm not sure what these things are, but they're pretty common. They call them the shadow people. What they are is three-dimensional shadows in the shape of a human, for the most part. Schizophrenics see them, meth addicts see them, and for the most part, they come in at night and they are darker than the rest of the room, and they can see them move around. And they're not always humanoid in shape. They may take out other shape, but for the most part, they're three-dimensional shadows. And I first noticed this with the prisoners when they who were locked up for using meth and got in trouble with meth. They would all see the shadow people. And that was new to me, you know, and it seemed very prevalent once meth came on the scene. And they called meth the devil's drug for good reason. So they would all report, and I'm talking hundreds of them, they would all report seeing the shadow people. So I started asking them, you know, what are the shadow people? What do they do? How do they act? What do you see? And what they reported, the prisoners especially, they would call them the tree people. They said they would sit up in trees. And they just seemed to be watching. But if they paid attention to them, they would start moving toward them. And the question about whether they could be seen by more than one person, there was one prisoner I worked with who was a meth addict, and he was telling me that he did an experiment with another meth addict. And they wanted to know exactly what this guy was asking. And this isn't with the voices, this is with the shadow people. And I'm not quite sure exactly what they are. I don't think they're anything good, because all they do is scare people. They don't speak. And the further psychotic or the more meth they're using, the guys who are way on out there start seeing their eyes. And their eyes are either lime green or red, which are not too good colors for eyes. So if they're much worse off, they see their eyes. So this guy was telling me that one day he and his friend, who were both meth addicts, wanted to see if they both saw the same shadow people. And I don't know if I told you this story before or not. So they went out to the Indian reservation out here south of here at night and drove out in the middle of nowhere on the Indian reservation, and one guy shot up meth and the other guy didn't. So the guy that shot up meth started seeing the shadow people, and he would point to him and ask the other guy, do you see that one over there? And, well, no. Well, how about this one over here? Do you see what he's doing? No. So they determined that the guy with the meth could see them and the other guy couldn't. So the other guy shot up, and then they both saw them. And then they compared notes, and they go, okay, you see the one over there? What's he doing? Well, he's doing this. He's moving to the left, and he's just walked behind that tree over there. So they compared notes that way, and they both came to the conclusion that they were seeing the same thing. You know, they were seeing the same shadow person. So there was an agreement there. Now, the thing about them moving in also came into play. He said by the time they were done comparing notes, they were completely surrounded by these shadow people out in the middle of the desert, and they got scared and they jumped in their truck and locked the doors, and they're watching them from inside the truck. And he said all of a sudden
and then they attacked the truck, yeah?
Well, he said the back of the truck went down like a boulder hit it. You know, the back went down, the front went up. It was like somebody dumped a big rock in the back or something. And that got my attention, because I was thinking that, you know, these were ghosts or something. They couldn't cause any physical anything. But when he said the back of the truck went up, well, that was a physical response. And he said they got scared. They started the truck and they drove out of there as quick as they could, almost wrecking the thing. I asked him, did they follow you? And he said, no, they didn't follow him. But the meth, the meth addicts, when they start using meth, they start seeing these shadow people. And they believe at first that these are hallucinations. And when they stop using the meth, they disappear. And then they use it again and they come on again. But they're thinking, as long as they go away, they're thinking these are hallucinations. And then one day they don't. They don't go away. They're stuck, and they're hearing the voices, and they're seeing these shadow people all the time. And that's the same way with the voices. The voices may come on for a while they're using meth. They hear these voices, and then when they come down, they go away. And that may go on for a period of months until one day the voices don't go away. And I've seen more people go psychotic on meth than any other drug. I mean,
and faster.
And faster. And like I said, the prisoners called it the devil's drug for a very good reason.
Yeah.
So where were we? Did I answer that question?
So the next question is, again, AI. Some researchers of this reality say that AI is running everything except souls, but influences people who have souls. Some say that this reality is just controlled and influenced. I don't know. I'm open to all possibilities. Is it something like a hive mind entity is doing its work through infected smaller entities that then influence people? Are they different entities that have different agendas and behave and express themselves differently, like different personalities from case to case? Yeah, I think you answered that, a huge chunk of that, when you said that it seemed to you robotic to a certain degree. Yeah.
Yeah. What part of that didn't we answer? I think we didn't answer part of it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Let me see what page we're on. Yeah, I think we answered a good bit of that. I'm trying to find out where that one was. Okay, read it to me again, and let me make sure we answered all of it.
Again?
And I'll stop you on any part I thought we didn't answer.
Okay. You don't find it?
No, I don't find it.
Okay.
I got to where the voices the patient hear. Did the patients identify the voices with any detail? Then
Okay.
Okay, here's question 5. Let's see. Oh, okay, these were the smaller entities. Okay, I got it.
Got it?
Yeah. So I did mention earlier that there does seem to be a, what do you call it, hierarchy. There was one, like I said, I was working with one patient where we got rid of all the lesser voices. Okay, so he was free of the voices. And then all of a sudden, another one appeared. And I said, where did that one come from? And that voice said, well, I'm the leader, I'm the head of these others. And then we had the thing with the pit too, where they were told that if they didn't follow their orders, they would be set to the pit. Or if they were identified, if they were discovered to be a separate entity from the person himself. So I can't emphasize that these things do not want their victims to understand that they are separate from who they are. They want them to think that all their negative thoughts belong to them, that there is no difference between them and these thoughts that are flowing into their head. And once they got that, then they got you. Because as far as the victim's concerned, they don't exist. It's them. It's the person himself who is causing these things. So we dealt with the AI thing. We dealt with the hive mind thing because all the things are the same. Yeah, there appeared to be hierarchies, and the ones I remember talking to one voice that said that it was told that it didn't have any light, and that if it didn't do what its boss told it, it would cease to exist. Mm-hmm. And then I said, okay, let's take a trip. And so I imagined, this is weird working with the voice. I said, okay, let's take a trip. Let's go look deep inside you. And I would imagine that we were going down through these layers of dark fog. And I said, do you see anything yet? And it would go, no. And then I'd wait a while and imagine that we were still traveling down deep into this entity and ask it again, do you see anything yet? And it says, yeah, I see a dim orange light. And then I would ask it, I said, weren't you told that you didn't have any light? And it said, yeah, that's what I was told. And I said, well, you see it for yourself, don't you? And you know what surprised me is that voice got angry that it was lied to. And I'm like, and that happened time after time after time. Once they found out that they had light, you know, it was dim, but they had light, they would get angry at these other voices that were driving them to do the things they're doing. And that made a huge difference. And it still boggles my mind, and that reaction was consistent. You know, when you do that trip with them and they see that they do have light, because they were told that the light is evil, that the light will destroy them, you know, and you ask them to stick their hand in the light and ask them, well, does the light burn you? And most of them will say no. One of them, I remember, said yes, and I said, oh, come on, no, it doesn't. And he goes, oh, yeah, okay, it doesn't. And so we'll go in the light. And if they will walk in the light and they will call a relative, somebody they trust, to come and take them, if they leave, then that voice is gone. And the way I would get them to do that would say, okay, you were told that if you were discovered as separate from the patient, that you would be punished. So they're going to punish you if you don't leave. And the second thing, you know you weren't supposed to be speaking to me as a separate entity, so you violated that rule also. So if you don't leave, you know what's going to happen to you. And they would go, okay, and they would go. And like I said, once, and it's not always a person who came to get them. Sometimes it was a horse or a dog, you know, something that they trusted. But if they would leave with it, that voice would leave with it. That voice was gone. Mm-hmm. Now there might be others there, and their supervisors. I'd never get their supervisors to do that. You know, they would come and they wouldn't even approach the light. They wouldn't even go looking for it. So yeah, there's like a hierarchy to them. It said, would non-Christians do, what could non-Christians do to help themselves? Mm. That's a lie program that we have we talk to in the book, and on
yeah,
Sherry's
and I
website.
think reading anything that is really uplifting and has a high frequency is useful. It doesn't have to be a religious text.
No, it doesn't. Yeah, anything that would drown them out, to break that negative thought repetition that keeps running over and over again, because they're going to keep trying to insert negative thoughts. I mean, that's what they do. That's how they control you. Anything that breaks that, you know, challenging, they have to be stood up to. You know, the person has to individually stand up to them and say, I don't want you, I'm going to fight you. And not just rely on these drugs to do the work for them, because the drugs are just going to, it's like shooting a rhino in the butt with a big tranquilizer dart. As soon as that drug wears off, they're going to be right at your throat again. So getting rid of them and then moving down some positive spiritual path to get out of their frequency, you know, to a more positive frequency. So the mind is like a radio. I mean, it's like a radio receiver. The music that comes through the radio and the voice that comes through the radio doesn't belong to the radio. Mm. You're the one that changes the frequency. You have to change the channel, and that takes a little bit of work.
Yeah.
Do you think we answered that one?
Yeah, we answered that one. Would
Okay.
rejecting of thoughts that some people recognize as from an entity be helpful? Would being aware, observing, or non-thought state be helpful? Stronger mental strength state, inner state.
Okay. Let me find that. Okay. Would observing the thought help? Yes, definitely. You have to pay attention to, again, every negative thought about yourself or somebody else is put there by them. If you look and you ask yourself what my next thought's going to be, you don't know what it's going to be. And we talked about observing your thoughts and listening to them. You're not your thought, you are the one who's listening to them. So if you listen and act on that thought, you're going to get that result. So if you're listening to negative thoughts and you're acting on negative thoughts, you're going to get negative feedback back. I can't find that particular question on my thing here.
Shall I read it again?
Yeah, read it again. Let me see what I missed.
Would rejecting of thoughts that some people recognize as from an entity be helpful? Would being aware, observing, and non-thought state be helpful? Stronger mental strength state, inner state.
Yeah, non-thought would work too. Because if you're non-thought, you're present. I mean, if you're not thinking, you're in the present, and that's really the only place you can be. You can't be in the future, you can't be in the past, and these things are trying to get you to worry about the future or grieve as to bad things you've done in the past. If you stay in the present, then they really can't get you, because in the present everything's fine, and that's where everything happens, is in the present. So they're going to be constantly trying to move you out of the present and into the past or future, where they're going to get you to worry about stuff. And when you're present, you're present with everything around you, and everything has life. Everything is communicating. But you can't see that when you're eaten up with all this garbage that's running through your head all the time. So yeah, definitely watching your thoughts and keeping yourself on a positive frequency. There's one shaman, a Hawaiian shaman, who said if you repeat these words over and over again, and these are all positively charged words, and I think this is called Hopo, I can't pronounce it right, but the words are, I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you, and I love you. All of those are very highly positive charged words. If you repeat that over and over and over again, instead of listening to the garbage running through your head, it's going to bring you to a higher frequency. So you're blotting out all that garbage and you're repeating these words. And basically what you're doing is taking responsibility for every thought that comes into your mind, and every negative thought you're kind of saying you're sorry to the Creator for entertaining this negative thought on a lower frequency, to please forgive you, and that, I love the Great Spirit. So it completely blots out all that negative stuff.
Yeah. So, regarding voices via technology, that is voice to skull, I know we addressed that in one of our interviews already. Voice to skull does exist, synthetic telepathy, but you said, if memory serves, that you never came across that.
I've never come across anything like that. I strongly am suspicious that does not match the psychotic voices that people hear. It's more a direction. It doesn't have the same patterns. Like you were saying, what they do with the MK Ultra people is it's closer to hypnosis, which is kind of what these voices do too, because I remember one prisoner was telling me that, he decided he was going to kill himself. He was hearing voices. He took a gun, got in his car. He had, I don't know, a quarter tank of gas or something. So he said he was going to drive until he ran out of gas. And then he was going to shoot himself with this pistol that he brought. So he kept driving. He ended up in the desert, stopped the car, got his gun, went and sat on a rock. And this bird, he said this bird he'd never seen before. And he'd lived in the desert all his life, but this bird came and started screaming at him, just absolutely screaming at him. So he got the gun and he fired the gun at the bird, and the blast of the gun woke him up as if he had been programmed. He was going to kill himself, and then when the gun went off, it kind of like, what am I doing? What am I doing? Mm. So yeah, there is kind of a hypnotic effect also, because the voices get the person to do self-destructive behavior. I mean, they're doing something that is not natural. The normal entity, the normal biological being, wants to seek pleasure and avoid pain. That's not what's happening with schizophrenics. It's almost as if they're seeking pain. They're constantly sabotaging themselves. They're constantly doing things that are not in their best interest. They're killing themselves in horrendous numbers. It's almost like, their mind is being taken over by these things. And a lot of them don't realize that these are, look at the suicide rate in the US. It's 47,000 people killed themselves in the United States last year. Mm-hmm. What does that say about the mental health system here? And they're not dealing with any of this stuff that we're talking about. That's where it all starts. That's where it all originates, is the thought. Instead of going into, the cognitive behavioral guys, they're about as close as any of them, but they don't realize that there's something beyond the thought. They're saying, okay, we'll deal with the thought, but they don't realize that there's an entity behind that thought that is injecting those thoughts. They don't study where those thoughts come from and what the reason for them entering the person's mind is. The whole spiritual area is just left out. And that's the way it was when I was in school. I mean, it was as spiritually dry as the Sahara Desert. And they never mentioned anything about spirits or where thoughts came from or spiritual health. And there wasn't even a clear concept of what mental health was. I mean, like, okay, if you're happy, you're mentally healthy. But you have to get down to the level where they're dealing with the thought and where the thought comes from and how to interfere with that thought and how to break it. And to understand that there are entities that are actually injecting these thoughts into our minds. And everybody's experienced where they're walking down the sidewalk and all of a sudden this horrible thought just barges into their mind. And it's like, it's like, do this horrible thing or say this horrible thing. And it's like, where did that come from? Like, that's not my thought. That doesn't belong to me. I would never do anything like that. But still, it's upsetting to get that thought. I mean, everybody's experienced that. And how many of them ask, where did that come from? It's not mine. It doesn't belong to me. I would never do anything like that. Those are all instances of where these things come in. And with schizophrenics, it's clearer than anywhere else. Once you start looking at that, it's very clear when you start studying the voices that these voices do not belong to them. They have an ulterior agenda. They have a different motivation. It's the split mind. I mean, they don't belong to the patient. They don't belong to the person himself. Their agenda is very different. I remember Sherry saying in one of her stories that they were talking and trying to convince her to just let go and let them take over, and telling her how much easier it would be if she would just give them up and not, not try to fight them. So yeah, the voices are
anybody who is telling you just give up usually doesn't have your best interest.
No. No, these things do not have your best interest in mind. I can guarantee it. And as long as psychiatry keeps telling, people, they're doing people a grave disservice by telling them that these things are hallucinations without any evidence on their part at all. They haven't studied these things. They haven't asked any questions of these things. They just, the way they were programmed in medical school, paid for by the drug companies, that, drugs are the only way to treat these things. And that's what they're teaching. That's doing us a grave disservice. I mean, there are people all over the world. I mean, this is one of the world's one of the 10 most severe health problems on the planet. And here's these guys making a fortune off of these people's misery with their toxic drugs. I think I told you about Dr. Omar in Turkey, who wrote a journal article. He watched a shaman cure schizophrenics. And he wrote a journal article and said, hey, listen, the medical establishment at least needs to look at this. And they attacked him all up one side and down the other, man. Some highfalutin lady and worked in one of the big universities in England said, oh yeah, he's driving us back to the Stone Age. I mean, this is, they won't even look at it. They won't. It's like, oh yeah, we got this degree and we're the guys and we know everything about mental health and we're telling you this is the way it is. And you ask them, well, what evidence do you have for that? And they go, well, none, just because we're telling you, you believe us. And, stick it in your left ear, buddy.
Yeah, okay. So, Jerry, we made it.
Did we? We got through all of them?
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's good.
And I just wanted to briefly mention, in case I have overlooked your question, it is nothing personal. Things can happen. So, yeah, Jerry, thank you very much for answering all these questions.
Well, you're more than welcome. And
Sherry, quite a while.
Sherry will be sending you a free copy of the book.
Oh, thank you.
So it'll be coming your way. And, after you take a look at that, I mean, it has kind of a different approach to it in some cases. But, if you have any questions on that, we can do one just on whatever questions you or your readers have over the book.
Okay. Yeah, but, sure. As soon as I've, first of all, I have to read it. But
yes, you got to get it.
Would be a good idea.
Would be good. So it's coming your way. We got your address, I think.
Yeah, and then I will contact you after that.
Okay.
Yeah. So, guys, this was it. Night Flight for today, a longer version, and stay safe and sound, and have a good time.
And thank you for helping us get this information out, because the mental health system, the way it is now, is an absolute abject failure.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
All right.